All right, so he was just bringing up 1948, and that's one of the books I've got teed up for you. But before I can get to 1948, he said also no one talks about the Irgun, the Stern Gang in the History of Terror series. So we need to learn a little bit about the Irgun, and then we'll get to 1948. So let's do these books like this. Let's go here. This book is interesting because it has a nice timeline, and then we get to introduction. I'll zoom you in. In October 1944, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, described the Irgun as follows: an underground quasi-military organization with headquarters in Palestine. See, it did exist back then. Look at that. Fanatical Zionists who wish to convert Palestine and Transjordan into an independent Jewish state. They advocate the use of force, violence, terrorism, as we'll see in a minute, against the Arabs and the British to achieve this maximal political goal. And then, if I zoom up a little bit, 1925, Zev Jabotinsky founded the Revisionist Zionism organization, whose non-religious, what is that, Tony? Non-religious right-wing ideology would lead to the formation of the Irgun and ultimately of the Likud party, from which the neocons made the preemption 1998 that we've learned about, and CFR and PNAC and all that good stuff that boils up to 9/11. This all starts with commencing operations in the British Mandate of Palestine, 1931, and then eventually with the bombing of the King David Hotel, killing 91 people. This is back in 1946. And eventually that leads Israel to its being recognized by a state. Here's a 1941 poster distributed by the United States for the United Palestine Appeal. Interesting.
Yeah, conceptually, it had been conceived of by 1925, and to that author's credit, 1931 is when it became a full force in the Palestine region, and it maintained so until 1948. It's important to also note it was an offshoot of the older and largest Jewish paramilitary organization called the Haganah, which I mentioned in depth last week.
And we're going to differentiate.
And the Irgun is
in a couple minutes here. I also wanted to show this the enlistment poster. Pretty interesting. Interesting that it's not unlike the story of America with the Union Jack involved so much over here. So that's Irgun. Now let's go to 1948, definitive history of the first Arab-Israeli war by Benny Morris, who we featured last week. And in this book, I had pages marked for you. Where did they go? Where did they go? All right, so I'm going to go to the next book because I can't find my page marker. This one, by Blood and Fire, the July 22nd, 1946, the attack on Jerusalem's King David Hotel by the Irgun, the Stern Gang. And this has some very interesting Anglo-American foreshadowings, Tony. It's funny how these things work because we were just talking about Churchill, right? Well, Churchill's all up in this. Right here, page 78. So it's talking about the proto-Israeli activists like Ben-Gurion. We're going to learn some interesting stuff about Ben-Gurion. He has a long history before he became the prime minister of Israel. After the announcement by the Colonial Office in August 1945 that the white paper would continue, the activists led the Haganah into an alliance. Okay, this is called the Joint Command with the Stern Gang and the Irgun, which sometimes you can say are interchangeable. Beginning in October 1945, units from all three groups staged separate coordinated attacks on British government installations. So the British are controlling the mandate. This is how they start to fight to get their own country by blood and fire. Because it was the most powerful member of the alliance, the Haganah had the power to veto operations proposed by the Stern Gang or Irgun. The activists constructed elaborate arguments to convince moderates, and also known as Weizmannites for Chaim Weizmann, that these sabotage operations were defensive and not a departure from Havlaga. They argued that more Jews were needed to protect the Yishuv from the Arab attacks. Therefore, the sabotage of installations, such as radar towers that track down illegal immigrants, was done to protect the Yishuv's defensive capabilities it constituted a strategy called defense of the defense. The activists also agreed that since soldiers manning the radar towers traveled to them by train and road, blowing up the railway and road bridges was also defense of defense. This logic enabled them to justify attacking any target in Palestine while still claiming to be defending the defense and exercising restraint, Tony. So this is 1946. This has nothing to do with the past week or two. Activists further corrupted the doctrine of Halaga by announcing that counterattacks were permissible if, quote, the scope of the Jewish reprisal is equal to the magnitude of the British attack, end quote. So if the British blew up a hotel, they could blow up a hotel, would be the strategy. During the first half of 1946, so this is right after World War II, Chaim Weizmann's been working for like 40 years on he and Theodor Herzl's dream, right? It's about to maybe come to fruition. They've defeated Hitler. They're trying to get their state. During the first half of 1946, Weizmann and other moderates fought these compromises. They didn't want to use terrorism, Tony. They denounced the Haganah's alliance with the Sternists and Irgun, tried to minimize the number of sabotage operations approved by the Joint Command, and denounced as immoral operations which posed any threat to human life. Yet, although most moderates feared that violence would corrupt Zionism, they also sympathized with the outrage that motivated the activists and terrorists. So let me get on the screen. Terrorists. Weizmann expressed the dilemma facing moderates when he addressed the Anglo-American Committee in March. Quote, I hate political violence, he said. I am uncompromisingly against it. It can only do us harm. It can never do us any good. But I cannot help the understanding the reason why these young men are driven to despair. After the Anglo-American Committee left Palestine, the Joint Command stepped up its attacks. In desperation, Weizmann wrote to Churchill and begged him to persuade the Labor government to reach a decision about Palestine's future that would undercut terrorism. He wrote, you will know that the conditions here are very difficult. He's under very great strain. So he's begging. He's like, hey, stop supporting these guys who are using violence. But for Churchill and his government, violence is the only way out. They are in on this King David bombing, King David Hotel bombing. But let me continue reading further. In May, British Foreign Secretary Bevan, so they're going to make fun of him a couple pages ahead, so his name's Bevan, announced that he would carry out the Anglo-American Committee's recommendation to admit 100,000 Jews only if the United States bore some of the cost in settling and policing them, and only if the Jewish underground armies disarm themselves. So that's what the British Foreign Secretary said. What do you think is going to happen, Tony? They're going to form an argument, a really strong word argument. Weizmann agonized over the letter, decided not to send it. So he's trying to write back and convince them not to use terrorism to achieve their means, right? And then before we get to July 22nd, very famous date, we're going to go to July 30th through July 2nd, June 30th through July 2nd. The government lifted the curfew at 6 on Sunday morning. Within an hour, teenage boys and girls with handkerchiefs tied over their faces raced through the Jewish neighborhood, slapping up posters. Crowds gathered quickly. It was a challenge to read the posters before the police could rip them down. The Irgun posters bore their familiar distinctive emblem, a rifle held high in the fist over a map of Palestine and Transjordan. Underneath was the motto, only thus. They described the, quote, Nazi British enslavers as, quote, bloodthirsty, fascist hooligans and exterminators whose hands were, quote, stained with boiling Jewish blood, end quote. The Palestine police were, quote, the British Gestapo and the British SS. The Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevan, Adolf Bevan. So that's about as much of an insult you could leverage back then. One poster read, the rulers of Britain actively helped the Nazis destroy the Jews of Europe. Fact. Another promised that, quote, rivers of blood would flow, for the Irgun had sworn an oath to take revenge on the British Nazi enemy and repay him, the destroyer of our nation, the murderer of our children. And then they had like a poem. The Haganah posters also promised retribution and compared the British to Nazis. Britain has declared a war on the Jewish people. The Jewish people will reply with war. Jewish resistance will continue. Jewish resistance has only begun. Maybe it doesn't rhyme. Maybe it's the language translation, Tony. What do you think? All right, now here's
That's a
as they
scholarly
say.
work outlining the evidence counter to Ben Shapiro's take that these were, not forced migrations of individuals. This was, rather of their volition based on Arab leadership to have them leave the area because they were in disdain over the fact that Israel has gained a territory for themselves that can be now called the country of Israel.
Daily
And so
Wire
that's
can't afford this, Tony. They can't get this book.
and like I'm just to reinforce exactly what you're saying. That's very fair. But you already mentioned the Irgun. Let's just go to, for example, the Nakba. Here, let me put this up on screen. The Nakba, literally,
Is it too early for
quote
Nakba
unquote,
Nakba jokes?
the
Because
disaster
there's going to
or
be a second
catastrophe.
Nakba. Is it too soon?
That might be too soon. Catastrophe or cataclysm, that's how it's translated. Also known as the Palestinian catastrophe, was the 1948 permanent displacement of a majority of the Palestinian Arabs. The term is used to describe both the events of 1948 and the ongoing occupation of the Palestinians in the Palestinian territories, the occupied West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, as well as their persecution and displacement in the Palestinian territories and in Palestinian refugee camps. Now, what's important to point out about this first section here is the footnotes here. So Webman, 2009, and Saudi. So I looked up some of these quotes. Like these are all very scholarly works. In Indiana University Press, Adel Manna, the Palestinian Nakba and its continuous repercussions. Let's look at this one. This is Ahmed H. Saadi, Columbia University Press. This is the book entitled Nakba. It goes into Palestine, 1948, and the claims of memory. There's another one, the Palestinian Collective Memory and National Identity, Mir Litvak. So these are all scholarly works from different decades, all outlining the same sort of tragedy. Now, we could say that maybe their references, maybe their evidence they permit inside these scholarly works isn't reality, or maybe they all stumbled upon similar evidence and was able to report on this. Some seem secular, some seem there's a couple Arab intellectuals referenced here as well. Some were actually, there's one here that was Jewish. In fact, one of the quotes, let's look at this one, just from the Nakba, or one of the footnotes here, has to do with Haaretz, if I can find it correctly. Yeah, this is by Saeb Erekat, excuse me. Quote, Israel must recognize its responsibility for the Nakba and the Palestinian tragedy. It's from Haaretz. It was archived October 10th, 2023. It was rather written, I think, on February 26, 2021. So even from an Israeli newspaper, more left-leaning, I believe, if memory serves, but still, there's a number of works from different individuals that seem to highlight the same sort of reality, that it wasn't just sort of an immigration of their own volition, that they decided to leave the territory just because Israel was awarded, or the Zionists were awarded Israel. It seems to be that there was a conflict, and there had been a conflict instantiated through terrorist activity through the Irgun and the Haganah. Now, just to refresh people's memory about good old David Ben-Gurion, I read this last week. I'm just going to read it one time again very quickly. This comes from Whitney Webb, One Nation Under Blackmail. Such was the historical mission of the Haganah, quote-unquote, defense, an organized Zionist paramilitary network that had been set up by the Jewish Agency, an active branch of the World Zionist Organization. The World Zionist Organization was founded, I believe, in 1895. The Jewish Agency, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, oversaw the creation of numerous towns, villages, communal outposts, and defense groups in mandatory Palestine. Now, why would you need to set up military bases and defense groups in mandatory Palestine? Anyways, the Jewish Agency would later atrophy, only to be relaunched by one of Leslie Wexner's mentors, Max Fisher, in 1970. The formation of the Haganah, and I got into Max Fisher last week, the formation of the Haganah in 1920 was a major step forward towards the formation of the Israeli state. So they needed a defense force. They needed Irgun, which is like a terrorist organization of that defense force, loosely associated, to instantiate the Israeli state, or the Zionist state called Israel. Let's continue here. Vital to its functioning was the training and arms provided by the British military. Major General Orr Charles Wingate, who had been dispatched to help administer British control over the territories, worked closely with the Haganah. Wingate even organized joint British Army Zionist paramilitary commando units dedicated to patrolling its. Yes, exactly. In 1945, the Haganah began its effort to stockpile weapons, ammunition, aircraft, non-lethal supplies, and machine tools. 1945.
Machine tools. Well, they
sourced from
bombed the
around the
hotel in
globe.
1946. So how long did that work
Right,
out?
right.
Maybe we should arm and train ISIS and see if it works this time. Maybe.
In the U.S., Ben-Gurion reached out to a close associate, Zionist activist Rudolf Sonneborn, who had traveled to Palestine years earlier to survey the construction of Jewish villages on behalf of the World Zionist Organization. Under the leadership of Sonneborn, 18 or so Jewish millionaires and billionaires were recruited into bankrolling the supply effort. Thus, Sonneborn Institute, as it was known, was born.
It doesn't name them,
The,
does it?
the
But
Institute, an active
Benny Morris
collaboration.
does. I found the references that I was looking for.
And then this is the final things. And then again, we read this last week, but just to reiterate, the Institute and activist collaboration of Zionist millionaires and billionaires that pursued specific Zionism related causes would later serve as a sort of model for the quote unquote mega group, founded years later by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman in 1991, both very strong pro Zionist provocateurs and financiers. The Sonneborn Institute's chief asset was a Haganah operative named Yehuda Aratzi, and during World War II, he served as a soldier in the Jewish Brigade, a British Army unit that recruited its fighters from the immigrant populations living in mandatory Palestine. By 1945, anyway, so it gets into more of the history with that.
All right, so let's jump ahead to 1946. This is a map of the King
1945,
David,
right? It's when they
Hotel,
stockpiling arms.
Right, and getting training. And now they get to fight for their freedom against the people who trained them last year.
How
I'm just trying to. Ben Shapiro missed this piece. He missed that day in the history of Israel class.
Seems to be contradicting evidence.
This is a big deal. So, July 22nd, 1946. There's a whole detailing in this book, Blood by Fire. But I want to take you to this book, 1948, by Benny Morris, because this is the history of the first Arab-Israeli war, and this is also covered in here. It's called Operation Ozzy Osbourne. No, Operation Black Sabbath. That's what it is. Operation Black Sabbath. And by the way, Tony, I did get a Nakba joke written.
Oh yeah.
Nakba, who's there? One state solution. No, thank you. It's not an offer. And then the door blows open. But maybe that's too soon. All right. This is going from 1948 by Benny Morris, famous Israeli historian. You could he used to talk about the Nakba. He doesn't do it so much anymore. So you gotta check that out. Page 5. Don't have to read too far into the book to get a little history on this situation. Let's go over here. Herzl is talking about Theodor Herzl dashed off a political manifesto, the Jewish state, 1896. I think it was called Der Judenstaat in German, and spent his remaining years organizing the Zionist movement. He unsuccessfully canvassed Europe's potentates, including Sultan Abu Hamid II of Turkey, to grant the Jews a state. But the Sultan, unwilling to relinquish any part of his steadily diminishing empire, rebuffed Herzl, a master bluffer who had promised the Ottomans billions, which he did not have and probably could not have raised. And although some of Europe's leaders, most notably Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, were interested in getting rid of their Jews, none were enthusiastic enough to challenge Ottoman rule in Palestine or to vouchsafe any of their own imperial domains for a Jewish purpose. Herzl was equally unsuccessful with Europe's Jewish financial barons. The Rothschilds and their ilk were wary of the wild-eyed prophet or of seeming to engage in an activity that smelled of dual loyalty. Herzl died, possibly of syphilis, in 1904, a broken man at the head of a poor, unsuccessful movement. Then it talks about the Basel 1897, the world's first Zionist Congress, organized by Herzl, had resolved to establish a publicly and legally secured home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The delegates had avoided the words state and sovereignty for the fear of alarming or antagonizing Gentiles, including the Sultan or Jewish magnates. But that was what the Zionists intended. So it goes on to talk about the Zionist enterprise as something that started out with Herzl, continued by Weizmann, and during the time in between, they're like writing back forth with, Cecil Rhodes about his nascent apartheid state and what a great idea his state is, and they'd like to create something like that. And they keep calling it Palestine the whole time. When they're like, they've got designs on this other place, the other place that they had designs on was called Palestine. So Operation Black Sabbath is the next reference in this book. So let's skip ahead a couple pages and let's learn about this operation where they got the King David Hotel going. Where did that card go? I had 2 cards. Oh, here it is. Here it is. I got you. Instead of arguing with myself about where the card is, I can just I can read for you. This comes from page 35. Let's see. They're talking. This is Frank Idelet and a bunch of Anglo-American establishment, Cecil Rhodes Roundtable people being discussed. And then it comes to another report called on the Arabs to annihilate all European Jews in Palestine. Interesting that this is going on back then, right? So the AAC report was officially condemned by the Arab League Council in 1946. The publication of this report led to a resumption of Jewish attacks on British targets, culminating in the Palma's Night of the Bridges. On 29 June, the British responded with Operation Agatha, dubbed in Zionist historiography as Black Sabbath, designed to cripple the Haganah. For 2 weeks, the security forces scoured the Jewish towns and rural settlements for men in arms, and even occupying the Jewish Agency building in Jerusalem, which in fact contained a Haganah headquarters, and arrested 4 JAE members, including Sturtok. But his had obtained advanced warning, and most Haganah commanders escaped the dragnet. The operation was only marginally affected Haganah capabilities. However, the Black Sabbath attack provoked vengefulness, with the IZL ironically taking up the cudgel for its sometime enemy, the Haganah. With faulty coordination with the Haganah, IZL sappers on 22 July, that's when the bombing took place, placed a number of bomb-laden milk containers in the basement of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. 91 British, Arab, and Jewish officers and officials died. And Anglo-American discussions continued after that. So there is an act of terrorism that took out 3 groups of people, including their own and their ally, as well as the enemy. That led to the British mandate coming to an end, and the state of Israel eventually getting Nelson Rockefeller. That's his name. He got blackmailed. He wasn't the blackmailer in that case. Approval for Latin American votes. So the state was created. So these things are conveniently left out of most of the official super conservative positions that don't question any of this stuff and never look into the origins of Christian Zionism or Zionism, as a matter of fact.
Which the origins, well, maybe later on we'll get to Greg Reese report that does a good job of going back the whole way to Sabbath, something I mentioned last week, and his importance in sort of instantiating in Judaism the idea of the need to go back to a nation state based on his messianism and his self-proclaimed mystic revelations. So I mean, it starts back in the 17th century and pays itself forward with the nation state avalanche that took place in the 19th century. So I think it's important to understand it's sort of rooted in a sort of messianism / manifest destiny ideal, that comes out of weird mystical states, supposedly purported by a messianic figure in Judaism. That's obviously considered to be not legitimate by Judaism as itself. He's been repudiated, but nonetheless, interesting that a lot of those ideas and the continuation and the instantiation of that idea paid itself forward, because after that, groups were set up with the idea that yes, we should, after the diaspora, we should have a right to go back to what is considered our territory based on the Book of Kings, the Exodus, the scripture.
Did you like
theology,
how Shapiro
and then
went
based
from like
on
3,000 years ago
mysticism?
to 1920?
Yeah, I love how
in 70 AD, Jerusalem was overthrown, and then in 1920, he skips over even the Balfour Declaration. Like, there's a big stretch of history there. Like, if you the argument is militarily tough can displace people. Like, we read that earlier tonight. Isn't that what happened in 70 AD then? Like, if you apply that now, we also want to apply it to the history. And when they don't contradict, we're going to consider that to be truthful, factual stuff. Right now, they're contradicting like a mofo.
Yeah,
So
he's committing a very general fallacy, many fallacies. We want in particular to look out
and
for
he's a
is when they
lawyer. He
build
knows
straw man.
better.
It's yeah, neglected aspects. Like he's purposefully he's referencing them in this very loose fashion, as though like, well, the counter position is that, you know, there was you know, the Nakba, you know, actually happened or didn't, you know, happen the way the Arabs say. But no, look at what our Constitution says and look what David Ben-Gurion says. So it's like, well, if you're going to quote your Constitution and you're going to quote David Ben-Gurion, both of which are very dubious sources, to say the least, because like one is just words on paper. The other one is an individual that was related to the Haganah in the 1920s and 30s and helped instantiating that organization and the creation of such and organizing it. It probably implicated in a lot of those sort of terroristic activities, or at least had know-how of how that was going to go about. If you're going to use him as a reference, like at least try to debunk the arguments by many other scholars, all the books you just presented, all the references I just read and the footnotes just on like a Wikipedia page as an example. Try to at least negate like the evidence they're bringing to the table, but he doesn't. He sort of glosses over it like, well, that's their position, but I'm just right. Here's my position. So he does this very surreptitious way, this rather beguiling technique of creating straw men through neglected aspect by loosely referencing the neglected aspect without providing context for it. And that's the way, I mean, that
people who create straw men,
Ali's,
you should know that straw men are very flammable, and apparently they have no brain. I learned that Wizard of Oz. The second part. But the other part is Ari Emanuel from Entourage. He's the Hollywood super agent, right? Immortalized in a miniseries. Rahm Emanuel, former chief of staff for Obama, mayor of Chicago, famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Don't think he originated that. He just popularized it. And Ezekiel Emanuel, Rhodes Scholar, chief doctor in charge of COVID during the pandemic, right? Those three brothers, their dad was an Irgun terrorist who helped to bomb the King David Hotel. Allegedly, according to books that I've read from Israeli scholars on the topic, this is not my opinion. This is me passing on knowledge from the past to you. It's called history teaching. So there's,
as I always say when I teach logic, you should juxtapose both sides and weigh the evidence. And you can see one side is at least neglecting to provide context for the other side of the story in regards to Ben Shapiro, and grossly overlooking what happened in 2006, 2007, especially with the economic embargo. I mean, come on, man.
Oh, for
like
sure.
That's just,
for sure.
You're just parroting propaganda to support the state of Israel unilaterally without any question, and you'll do whatever it takes to hold up your facade, whatever's left of it, of logic and reason and this lawyerly, attitude and disposition, to create all sorts of straw men based on neglected aspects and ad hominem attacks and ad veracundium, like appeals to certain authorities that they themselves were implicated in these terroristic organizations like David Ben-Gurion.
What this did, the King David Hotel bombing, and the rewarding of those terrorists with their own nation state, right? Because that's how it gets formed. This is the official history. This is not me blaspheming the official narrative. Well, maybe, but it's the official history, right? It's just inconvenient to the official narrative. Now, that precedent, what did they do? They claimed these terrorist attacks were in defense. They're all defensive terrorist attacks anywhere in Palestine, Tony. It's in their own defense. It normalized terrorism being rewarded. And that trend has continued for the past almost 100 or 80 years, let's say. There are these elements and aspects. And the United States, very sadly, the United States government does negotiate with terrorists on a regular basis, and many times arms and funds them. What makes the Grand Theft World podcast unique, invigorating, exciting, and informative? Most other podcasts out there are either doing straight up interviews or they're just covering the daily news. They're covering current events from the day they happened. And that is effective. It's useful. It's a great starting point. And then sometimes these current events change during the week past the first story. So we like to give it a little time. You have to wait till some of the dust settles on these stories in order to give them accurate coverage. And the other thing that's really missing in the media landscape is covering the articles that are coming out every day. That's great. That's necessary. But who's bringing in contextual history so that you can understand what has been going on for decades and decades to lead up to the machinations and actions that we see unfolding today? So what we do here on the podcast is we cover current events. Many of these things are censored, but we wait about a week. As a forensic historian, I focused mainly through my career on the history of globalism and collectivism and things that they call maybe the New World Order. There's a lot of facts to these sort of circumstances, groups, events, activities, working groups that they've had over time. So for Grand Theft World listeners, we not only break down the current events, most of which that are censored during the week, we provide you with contextual history, we give you the source notes, the references, we do deep dives, and this really empowers you with an understanding of context and history so that you can make more informed decisions in your life. There's also a community, a membership where you guys can actually ask questions. We can get into the show, we can share evidence. And there's a town hall weekly for Grand Theft World for those who listen to it and are interested in covering the stories that we don't get to during a 6-hour show. Listening to it an hour a day, you could easily consume the week's news, but you're going to have substance and meaning and context and understanding. And with that, you can make higher quality decisions in your life. So if you're interested in more quality in your life, go to grandtheftworld.com, click podcast at the top, and we'll see you there. Thank you.
These allegations are false.
This isn't Grand Theft Auto, folks. This isn't a video game.
What are the most surprising things that you discovered once you started pulling on that thread? Who he was connected to, what institutions he was influential over, what events he participated in?
Come on, man. What are we talking about? Come on, man. No.
You don't have to think about it, dude.
I got this quote because you said you didn't know much about Klaus Schwab. I made it my job to, as soon as this happened, I'm like, okay, this guy's their front man. Let me learn about the official history of the World Economic Forum. I got their 40-year history. I got every book that Klaus Schwab has written or ghostwritten. I went through those books. This is one of the most interesting passages.
Come on, man. Come